There is a place off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where the Atlantic Ocean has been keeping a secret for nearly 300 years. Not a rumor, not a legend passed between sailors who had drunk too much and remembered too little. A real secret, one made of gold and silver and human bones and the wreckage of a ship that was, for one brief and extraordinary period of history, the most dangerous vessel in the Western Atlantic. The ship was called the Whydah Galley. She was a three-masted galley built for the slave trade, fast enough to run down almost anything on the open ocean, and in the winter of 1717 she was captured by a pirate named Samuel Bellamy, a man history would eventually call Black Sam, a man who was 28 years old and at the absolute peak of a career defined by audacity, remarkable success, and a philosophy about wealth and power that was so radical for his time that his crew called him their Robin Hood of the sea. 9 weeks after Bellamy took the Whydah, she was gone. A nor'easter off Cape Cod swallowed her in the dark, and with her went over 140 men, the greatest concentration of pirate treasure ever assembled on a single vessel, and a mystery that would persist for 268 years. This is the story of the Whydah, the ship, the pirate, the treasure, and the man who found it. To understand what the Whydah meant, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1716. The War of the Spanish Succession had just ended. For over a decade, England, France, Spain, and their assorted allies had been grinding each other into economic dust across 2 continents, and the war had been fought largely at sea. That meant thousands of trained sailors, privateers, and naval veterans were suddenly without employment. The treaties had been signed, the commissions had been revoked, and the men who had spent years learning to sail warships and fire cannons were set loose on port towns from Bristol to Barbados with empty pockets and no particular prospects. Some of them went home, some found merchant work, and some of them looked at the trade routes they had spent years raiding legally under letters of marque from their respective governments and made a simple and logical calculation. The routes were still there, the ships were still there, the gold and silver and sugar and cloth were still moving. Only the legal permission had been removed. This was the beginning of what historians call the Golden Age of Piracy. A period roughly between 1715 and 1726, when the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard were effectively controlled by men who had made the decision that the line between privateer and pirate was a political fiction, and that they intended to ignore it. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard; Bartholomew Roberts, who captured over 400 ships; Charles Vane, John Rackham, Anne Bonny, and Mary Read. These were not romantic figures manufactured by later novelists. They were working criminals operating an informal but remarkably efficient redistribution system for Atlantic wealth, and they were genuinely feared by every trading nation involved in the Atlantic economy. Samuel Bellamy entered this world in 1715, which puts him at the very beginning of the Golden Age, and he entered it in a way that tells you a great deal about the man. He did not become a pirate because he was violent or reckless. He became a pirate because of a woman. Her name was Maria Hallett. She was a young woman from Eastham, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, and by most historical accounts, she and Bellamy were genuinely in love. Bellamy was English-born, working as a sailor, and the story goes that he wanted to make enough money to impress her family and marry her respectably. The Hallett family had money. Bellamy did not, and in 1715, word reached the colonial ports that a Spanish treasure fleet had gone down off the Florida coast in a hurricane, carrying over 14 million pesos in gold and silver. Bellamy went south to salvage it. He didn't find much. The Spanish had already recovered the bulk of their treasure using their own salvage teams, and the freelance salvagers who had rushed south from the colonies were mostly disappointed. Bellamy was one of them. He came back with very little and with a decision made. He fell in with a crew operating out of the Caribbean, men who had already been raiding shipping under the command of a pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, and he began his career in earnest. He was apparently a natural at it. Bellamy had the combination of qualities that made a successful pirate captain in the Golden Age. He was physically brave, tactically intelligent, a skilled sailor, and crucially, he had a quality of personal authority that made men want to follow him without coercion. This was not a minor thing. Pirate crews were democratic in a way that almost no other organization in the 18th century was. The captain served at the pleasure of the crew, received a larger share of prizes, but not a dramatically larger one, and could be replaced by vote if he lost the confidence of his men. To lead such a crew required genuine charisma, not rank. Bellamy became so effective and so admired that when Hornigold was voted out by his own crew for refusing to attack English ships, Bellamy was the man they turned to. By 1717, at the age of 28, Samuel Bellamy commanded a small fleet of ships and had captured over 50 vessels in roughly a year of active raiding. He was one of the most successful pirates in the Atlantic, and he had not yet been at it for 18 months. Then he took the Whydah. The Whydah galley was launched in 1715 from a shipyard in England. She was built specifically for the triangular slave trade route, the brutal commercial system that moved manufactured goods from England to West Africa, enslaved people from West Africa to the Caribbean and American colonies, and sugar and rum and other colonial commodities back to England. The name Whydah came from the West African port of Whydah in what is now Benin, which was one of the primary points of embarkation for enslaved people being transported across the Atlantic. She was a purpose-built fast ship, 3 masts, a length of approximately 100 feet, capable of carrying several hundred enslaved people in conditions of calculated suffering and fast enough to discourage interception by competing traders or pirates. She was armed with 18 cannon when she launched, and on her maiden voyage she delivered her human cargo to Jamaica and was making the return leg of her first circuit when Samuel Bellamy found her in February of 1717. He chased her for 3 days. The Whydah was fast enough that in different circumstances she might have run him down herself. But Bellamy had multiple ships, and he could coordinate, cutting off angles, hurting her, and after 3 days of pursuit in the waters between the Bahamas and Cuba, the Whydah's captain, Lawrence Prince, made the calculation that surrender was survivable and resistance was not. He was right. Bellamy was not in the habit of massacring surrendered crews. He took the ship, transferred Captain Prince and his crew to a smaller vessel with which they could make port, and made the Whydah his flagship. He then spent the next several weeks raiding aggressively up the American coastline, taking prizes, transferring their cargo and their most useful crew members aboard the Whydah, and accumulating what contemporaneous accounts and later archaeological evidence would confirm was the largest single concentration of pirate treasure ever documented. The Whydah, when she sank, was carrying the plunder of at least 54 ships, gold dust in bags, silver coins from Spanish mints in Mexico and Peru, pieces of 8 from a dozen different nations' trade routes, jewelry, weapons, navigation instruments, medical supplies, and an extraordinary diversity of personal items belonging to over 140 men who had come to the Whydah from across the Atlantic world, men from England and West Africa and the American colonies and France and the Caribbean, men who had made the choice, voluntarily or under coercion, to sail under the black flag. Bellamy was heading north along the New England coast in April of 1717, and there is very good historical reason to believe he was heading home. He was heading for Cape Cod. He was heading for Maria Hallett. He never arrived. On the night of April 26, 1717, a nor'easter moved in off the Atlantic with the particular violence that makes the New England coast one of the most dangerous stretches of shoreline in the Northern Hemisphere. The storm hit the Whydah and her companion vessels in the dark, with no warning sufficient to run for shelter, and drove them toward the coast. The Whydah struck a sandbar off Wellfleet on the outer arm of Cape Cod in approximately 16 feet of water. She hit hard, rolled, and broke apart within minutes. The mast came down. The cannons tore through the hull. The weight of 4.5 tons of gold and silver and seized cargo dragged her into the sand. Of the 144 men aboard the Whydah that night, 2 survived. Their names were Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been pressed into the crew against his will, and John Julian, a Cape Cod Native American pilot who had joined voluntarily. Both were pulled from the wreckage alive. Davis was subsequently tried and acquitted on the grounds of having been forced into the crew. Julian's fate is less clearly documented, though records suggest he was eventually sold into slavery, which stands as one of the uglier ironies in a story that already contains several. The other 142 men died in the surf. Samuel Bellamy, the most successful pirate of the early Golden Age, died at 28 years old, within sight of the coast he had come home to, without ever reaching the woman he had sailed from. The treasure went with him into the sand, and the Atlantic began the slow process of burying it. For 268 years, people knew roughly where the Whydah had gone down. The wreck was not a secret in the sense of an unknown location. The general area off Wellfleet had been identified almost immediately, and in the years and decades after the sinking, there were multiple attempts to recover the treasure, including an early 18th century salvage effort that apparently recovered a small amount of material before the wreck shifted in the sand and became inaccessible. The problem was not knowing where to look. The problem was the sand. The Cape Cod coastline is geologically dynamic in a way that defies casual description. The outer arm of the cape is made of glacial debris, sand and gravel deposited by the retreat of the last ice age, and it is constantly being rearranged by wave action, storm surges, and longshore drift. Sandbars appear and disappear in seasonal cycles. The bottom shifts. Material that is on the surface in one decade may be under 10 feet of sand in the next, and the Whydah's wreck site had experienced 2.5 centuries of this process. By the 20th century, the wreck was estimated to be under as much as 5 feet of sand in some places, scattered across a significant area of the seabed, with the heavier material having sunk deepest and the lighter material having dispersed over a wide radius. The state of underwater archaeology and treasure hunting technology for most of the 20th century was not up to the challenge. People looked. Nobody found anything significant. Then came Barry Clifford. Barry Clifford grew up on Cape Cod. He had heard the story of the Whydah as a child, the way children who grow up near famous local legends absorb them, not as history, but as something closer to myth, a story that belonged to the landscape he lived in. He became a diver. He became interested in underwater archaeology in a serious and methodical way. And at some point in the late 1970s, he decided that the reason nobody had found the Whydah was not that the treasure was unfindable, but that nobody had looked with sufficient rigor. He spent years in research before he put a boat in the water. He went to archives in Boston and London and the Bahamas. He read trial records from the prosecution of the 2 Whydah survivors. He studied historical accounts of the wreck and the early salvage attempts. He talked to maritime historians and geological surveyors and anyone who could tell him something useful about how a wreck behaved in the specific conditions of the Cape Cod seabed over a period of 2.5 centuries. He was also working against competition. The treasure hunting world in the late 1970s and early 1980s was aware of the Whydah. Mel Fisher had found the Atocha in Florida in 1985, demonstrating that spectacular undersea treasure recovery was possible, and the Whydah was the next obvious target for anyone with the resources and the ambition to go after it. Clifford filed for a research permit with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which established his legal claim to the search area, and he began working. In the summer of 1984, Clifford's team began systematic survey work off Wellfleet. They were using a proton magnetometer, an instrument that detects anomalies in the magnetic field caused by the presence of iron and steel, to sweep the seabed. The Whydah had been carrying iron cannons, iron anchors, iron fittings, and a great deal of other ferrous material. If she was down there in recoverable condition, the magnetometer would find her. On July 19, 1984, the magnetometer registered a significant anomaly in approximately 14 feet of water. The excavation that followed was slow, careful, legally complicated, and ultimately historic. Clifford's team found the first artifacts in 1985: a cannon, coins, navigational instruments. The material was consistent with an early 18th century vessel, consistent with the documented location of the Whydah's sinking, and the artifacts were coming up in quantities and condition that were immediately significant. But what transformed the discovery from significant to definitively historic was found on July 20th, 1985. A diver named John Byer surfaced with a corroded bronze bell. When the concretion was carefully cleaned away in the conservation lab, the inscription beneath read clearly: "The Whydah Galley, 1716." There was no longer any question. This was the ship. After 268 years on the bottom of the Atlantic, the Whydah had been found, and she was exactly what the historical record said she was: the only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever recovered, the only site where the physical evidence of Golden Age piracy could be excavated, studied, and preserved in its original context. The artifacts that came up in subsequent years of excavation numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Over 200,000 individual objects have been recovered from the Whydah site over the course of an excavation that is, remarkably, still ongoing. The site has not been exhausted. The sand continues to give up material in each diving season, and each piece adds to a picture of life aboard a Golden Age pirate vessel that no document, no court record, and no later account could provide with the same immediacy. Among the recovered material, over 10,000 coins from mints across the Atlantic world, a cross-section of the global economy of 1716, compressed into a single wreck site. Weapons, including pistols and muskets and edged weapons, many of them in states of preservation that allow detailed analysis of their manufacture and modification. Personal items of extraordinary intimacy, a silk stocking, a shoe buckle, a ring, things that belong to specific men, whose names in some cases can be attached to them through the trial records. Medical equipment, including a syringe that represents one of the oldest surviving examples of medical instruments carried aboard a working vessel, and human remains. Bones recovered from the Whydah site have been analyzed using modern forensic techniques and have revealed details about the men who sailed with Bellamy that no written record preserved. One set of remains included a leg bone with a healed fracture, suggesting a man who had broken his leg at some point in his life, received some form of treatment, recovered, and continued sailing. Inside a silk stocking recovered near the same remains was a shoe buckle and a pistol. The forensic anthropologists who examined these bones estimated the man's age at somewhere between 17 and 22 years old. He was somebody's child. He had a name nobody now knows. He had sailed with the most successful pirate in the Atlantic, and he had died in 16 feet of dark water on a stormy April night in 1717. And for 268 years, the sand had kept him. And now he's part of the permanent record of a moment in history that was more complicated and more human than any legend. The treasure of the Whydah is not simply gold and silver, though it is certainly that too. The official count of recovered precious metal exceeds 4.5 tons in estimated total original weight, making it by any measure the largest authenticated pirate treasure ever found. The monetary value in modern terms is difficult to calculate because the historical and archaeological value of the objects as artifacts far exceeds their value as raw material. And serious efforts to assign a single dollar figure tend to be exercises in creative accounting rather than meaningful assessment. What is certain is that the Whydah wreck site represents the single most important physical archive of Golden Age piracy in existence. The Spanish galleon wrecks of the Florida Keys give us the commercial side of the Atlantic economy. The Whydah gives us the pirate side, in a specificity and intimacy that is without parallel. The Whydah Pirate Museum in Provincetown, Massachusetts, holds the majority of the recovered artifacts and is the public face of an ongoing excavation and conservation effort that has been running for 4 decades. Clifford's organization continues to hold the search permit and continues to work the site. Each diving season brings new material up from the sand. There is genuine archaeological expectation that major sections of the ship's hull may still be preserved under the deeper sand layers, and if those sections are recovered intact, they will represent one of the most significant maritime archaeology finds in American history. Samuel Bellamy never got back to Cape Cod, but the ship that carried him did in a way that is stranger and more complete than any reunion he could have planned. The bones of his crew are in laboratories and conservation facilities where people examine them with scientific instruments that would have been incomprehensible to the men they belonged to. The coins they stole from 54 ships are in museum cases where school children look at them through glass. The cannons that made the Whydah the most feared vessel on the Atlantic coast are on display above ground for the first time in 3 centuries. And the bell that confirmed everything, the bronze bell with its 4 words and its date, sits at the heart of it all. The Whydah Galley, 1716. A ship built to carry enslaved people, captured by a man who objected to the theft of freedom, sunk by a storm on the way home to a woman, and found by a boy who grew up on Cape Cod with a story in his head that he decided to treat as a solvable problem rather than a myth. There are not many moments in the history of treasure hunting, maritime archaeology, or the long conversation between the living and the dead that are as complete as this one. The Whydah went down with everything aboard her, and everything is still there, and what has been brought up from the sand is not diminished by the recovery, but enlarged by it, given back to time and context and the long reckoning with what the Atlantic world was in 1717 and what it cost the people who lived in it. Black Sam Bellamy died 28 years old in a storm. He had been a pirate for less than 2 years. He captured more than 50 ships. He commanded a crew that came from 5 continents and believed, or at least said they believed, that the difference between a pirate and a merchant was only the honesty of the pirate about what he was doing. Whether that philosophy holds water across 3 centuries of distance is a question worth sitting with. What is not in question is this: the Whydah was real, the treasure was real, the men were real, and for the first time in the long history of piracy, as romance and legend and Hollywood invention, we have the physical evidence to prove it. The sand gave it back to us. Every shovelful, every artifact, every bone. The Whydah Galley. 1716. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. More stories like this one are coming. We'll see you in the next one.